Inside a run-down wooden house, a recently unemployed man sits helplessly beside his wife and his young nephew. As they prepare to share their last meal, an unexpected knock echoes at the door. Cautious, the man opens it to find an elderly woman lost in the cold asking for shelter. He hesitates, then invites her inside, sharing his food and the little warmth he has. The next morning, a stranger knocks on his door and says something he never imagined, and what follows will change his family's life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The house went dark at 6:43. David Miller sat in his living room chair, the one with the broken spring that dug into his left hip, and watched the streetlight outside paint a thin yellow line across the floor. It was the only light they had now. The power company didn't send warnings anymore. They just cut you off. David, Susan's voice came from the kitchen doorway. She hadn't turned on her phone's flashlight yet. Probably saving the battery. They'd learned to save everything. I know, he said. Noah's going to wake up cold. I'll get him another blanket. We don't have another blanket. David closed his eyes, 62 years old, and he was sitting in the dark in his own house, unable to keep his grandson warm. The air outside had that knife-edge sharpness that came in early December, the kind that found every crack in the window frames, every gap under the doors. I'll give him mine, David said. Susan didn't answer. She just stood there in the doorway, a shadow against another shadow. They'd been married 37 years. He knew what her silence meant. It meant she was trying not to cry, and she was trying not to blame him, and she was trying not to think about how their daughter would never have let it get this far. But Emily wasn't here anymore. The knock came 10 minutes later. 3 soft taps, like whoever was out there wasn't sure they should be knocking at all. David's chest tightened. Nobody knocked on doors at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night in December, unless something was wrong. Bill collectors didn't knock. The landlord had already been by twice this week. The neighbors knew better than to ask for anything. Don't, Susan whispered. But David was already standing. His knees popped, his back ached, everything ached these days, but especially the parts of him that used to feel capable. Through the window beside the door, he could make out a shape, small, hunched. An old woman it looked like, wearing a coat that seemed too thin for the weather. David, please, he looked back at Susan. She'd moved into the living room now, standing near the couch where Noah slept under his Mickey Mouse blanket, the one Emily had bought him 3 Christmases ago. Susan's arms were crossed over her chest, hands gripping her own elbows, defensive, afraid. And that fear touched something raw in David, because when had they become people who were afraid of opening their own front door? He turned the deadbolt. The woman on the porch was older than he'd thought, 70, maybe 75. She had white hair pulled back in a bun that was coming loose, and her coat, now that he could see it properly, was expensive. Wool. Probably cashmere. The kind of thing Susan used to admire in store windows before everything fell apart. I'm so sorry to bother you, the woman said. Her voice was steady, educated. Not the voice of someone who knocked on strangers' doors. My name is Margaret. I'm afraid I've gotten myself into a rather foolish situation. David's hand stayed on the doorknob. What situation? My driver had an accident. Nothing serious, but the car isn't drivable. We were on the highway about 2 miles from here, and I'm afraid my phone is dead. I don't know this area at all. She gave him a small, almost embarrassed smile. I saw your light and thought perhaps I could impose on you for a few minutes. Just to get warm and make a phone call. Light. David almost laughed. The streetlight wasn't theirs. But he didn't correct her. There's a gas station 3 blocks down, he said. They'll have a phone. I tried there first. It's closed. The convenience store on also closed. I walked quite a bit before I saw your house. David studied her face. No makeup, no jewelry, except for a simple watch. But everything about her spoke of money. The coat, the shoes, polished leather even though she'd been walking. The way she held herself, spine straight despite the cold. People with money didn't end up on his porch. Ma'am, I don't think I can pay you. She reached into her coat pocket. No. The word came out harder than he meant it. That's not. We're not. He stopped. What was he supposed to say? We're not a charity case. We're not desperate enough to take money from strangers. Both would be lies. Margaret's hand stilled. She looked at him for a long moment, and David had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he wanted her to see. The dark house behind him, the threadbare carpet visible through the doorway, the smell of the chicken soup Susan had stretched across 3 days, the last of it sitting in the pot on the stove, because they couldn't afford to waste a single drop. "I'm not offering to pay you for charity," Margaret said quietly. "I'm offering to pay you because your time has value, and so does your warmth, and I'm asking to borrow both." Something in David's throat went tight. "David." Susan had come closer. She was standing just behind him now. And when he glanced back, he saw that she'd wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. The blue one. The one she'd been wearing the day Emily called to say she was pregnant, that they were going to be grandparents, that life was about to get bigger and better and fuller. "It's fine," Susan said. She was talking to him, not to Margaret. "Let her in." "Susan, it's cold. Let her in." David wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons this was a bad idea. They didn't know this woman. They couldn't afford to share their space, their warmth, the last bit of safety they had in a world that had taken everything else. But Susan was already opening the door wider, already stepping aside. Margaret came in like she was entering a cathedral, slowly, respectfully. She didn't look around with judgment or pity, just stood in the entryway and waited. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." Susan gestured toward the couch. "You can sit. I'll get you some water. Please don't trouble yourself. It's no trouble." David closed the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home felt final, like he'd just locked them all into something he didn't understand. He stayed by the door, arms crossed, watching. Margaret moved to the couch, but didn't sit. She was looking at Noah. The boy was 5 years old, small for his age, with his mother's dark curls and his mother's long eyelashes. He slept on his side, one hand tucked under his cheek, the other clutching the edge of the Mickey Mouse blanket. His breathing was soft and even. "Your grandson?" Margaret asked. "Yes, he's beautiful." David didn't answer, didn't trust himself to. Susan returned with a glass of water, handed it to Margaret, then sat in the other chair, the one that didn't have a broken spring. She folded her hands in her lap like she was at a church service. Margaret took a sip, then set the glass on the coffee table. The table had a ring of water stains from years of use, and David watched as she carefully avoided putting the glass on top of them. "I need to be honest with you," Margaret said. "I don't think anyone is coming for me tonight. Your driver will have called someone by now, but that someone won't know where I am. I told him to wait with the car. I thought I could find a phone quickly." She smiled, but it was sad. Pride, I suppose. "I didn't want to admit I needed help." Susan leaned forward. "Do you have family? Someone we can call for you?" "No family. Not anymore." The words sat heavy in the room. "I'm sorry," Susan said. "It was my own doing." Margaret looked down at her hands. They were old hands, spotted and thin-skinned but steady. "I made choices. Some of them were right. Many of them were wrong. The wrong ones cost me the people I loved." David shifted his weight. This was getting too personal, too intimate. They didn't need this woman's life story. They needed her to make her phone call and leave. But Susan was looking at Margaret like she understood something David didn't. "What kind of choices?" she asked. "The kind that seemed reasonable at the time." Margaret's voice was soft. "I was powerful once. Very powerful. I ran companies, made decisions that affected thousands of people, and I told myself that the hard choices were necessary, that the people who got hurt were acceptable losses." She paused. "My daughter didn't think so." "What happened to her?" "She stopped speaking to me. Told me that power without principle was just cruelty wearing a suit." Margaret smiled again, and this time it was even sadder. "She was right, of course, but I didn't understand that until after she died. After it was too late to tell her." The room went quiet. On the couch Noah stirred, made a small sound, then settled again. "Why are you telling us this?" David asked. Margaret looked up at him. In the dim light from the street, her eyes were dark, unreadable. "Because you let me in. Because most people wouldn't have. And because I think you understand what it means to make a choice that costs you everything." David's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about us. I know you don't have electricity. I know you're afraid. I know there's a child sleeping on your couch who should be in a bed." She said it without judgment, just stating facts. "And I know that despite all of that you opened your door to a stranger. My wife opened the door, but you didn't stop her." Susan stood up. "I should check on Noah, make sure he's warm enough." She left the room and David knew it wasn't really about Noah. It was about giving him space, about letting him handle this however he needed to. Margaret stood as well. "I should go. I've imposed enough." "Where will you go?" "I'll figure something out. I always do. It's 28 degrees outside. I've been colder." David believed her. He didn't know why, but he did. She walked to the door, and David followed. His hand was on the knob when she stopped. "May I tell you something?" she asked. "Can I stop you?" That made her smile. A real smile this time. Small but genuine. "Probably not. I'm old and I've earned the right to be difficult." Despite everything, David almost smiled back. Soon Margaret said, "You're going to be faced with a choice. Not the small kind, like whether to open a door. A real one. The kind that defines what kind of man you are." "I think I've had enough of those," David said. "I know, but this one's coming anyway." She buttoned her coat and David noticed her fingers didn't shake at all, even though they should have. Even though she was old and cold and alone. "It won't be a choice to save you from poverty. It won't fix your electricity or fill your bank account. It will be a choice about what you keep." "Keep what? What matters?" She nodded toward the living room, toward the couch where Noah slept. "For the child who's living with you. The one who's watching everything you do, learning what kind of men exist in this world." David's heart was beating too fast. "How do you? I don't know anything. I'm just an old woman who got lost." She opened the door herself, let the cold air rush in. "But I've been where you are. I've stood at the edge of the choice between survival and principle, and I chose wrong." She looked back at him, and in the streetlight he could see tears in her eyes. "I lost everything that mattered, because I was so focused on keeping everything I had." "Wait," David said. "I don't understand." "You will." Margaret stepped onto the porch. "Thank you for the water, and for the warmth, and for not being too afraid to let me in." She walked down the steps, her shoes clicking on the concrete, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the streetlight's reach. David stood in the doorway until he couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. Then he closed the door and locked it. Susan was sitting on the floor beside the couch now, her hand resting on Noah's head. She looked up when David came back. "What did she say?" Susan asked. "I don't know." And that was the truth. He didn't know what Margaret had said, not really. Just that it felt important, like a warning, like a promise. "She left this." Susan held up something. A scarf. Silk, it looked like. Expensive. "She forgot it." "I don't think so." David took the scarf. It was soft, impossibly soft, and when he turned it over he saw a small tag, Hermes. He knew that name, knew what it meant. She was rich, Susan said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, why would someone like that be walking around in the cold? David didn't have an answer. He folded the scarf carefully and set it on the coffee table, next to the glass of water Margaret had barely touched. Outside, the streetlight buzzed and flickered. Inside, the house was cold and dark and full of questions. And on the couch, Noah slept, dreaming whatever 5-year-olds dreamed about, while the two people who loved him most in the world sat in the darkness and wondered what choice was coming. Morning came with gray light and no miracles. David woke in the chair, his neck screaming and his back locked up in 3 places. He'd fallen asleep there sometime after midnight, too wired to lie down, too tired to keep his eyes open. Now the sun was leaking through the curtains, weak and pale, and the house was still cold, still dark, still theirs, but barely. He pushed himself upright, wincing as his spine cracked. 62 was too old to sleep in chairs, too old for a lot of things he was doing now. Susan was in the kitchen, standing at the sink. She had the tap running, just a trickle, filling a small pot. They'd learned to heat water on the camping stove for coffee, one of 100 small humiliations that had become routine. "Any change?" she asked without turning around. David checked his phone. 2% battery, no messages, no missed calls, no sudden influx of money in the bank account he could barely stand to look at anymore. No. Then she was just a woman who got lost. David didn't answer. He walked to the coffee table, where the scarf still sat, folded precisely how he'd left it. He picked it up, ran his thumb over the silk. It was real, she was real. But nothing else about last night made sense. "I'm going to try to return this," he said. Susan turned off the tap. "How?" "I don't know. Maybe there's a phone number on the tag." "David." She said his name the way she used to say Emily's name when their daughter was doing something stubborn and pointless, with love and frustration in equal measure. "Just leave it alone. She might need it. She's a rich woman who can buy 100 more. That's not the point." Susan set the pot on the camping stove, struck a match, adjusted the flame. The blue light flickered across her face, making her look older than she was. Tired. So tired. "What is the point?" she asked. David opened his mouth, closed it. He didn't know what the point was. Just that something about Margaret, about the things she'd said, about the way she'd looked at Noah, felt unfinished. "I need to go to the library," he said, instead. "Check my email, see if anyone responded to the applications. It's Saturday. Libraries open until noon on Saturdays." Susan nodded. She knew the schedule as well as he did. They'd spent enough time there, using the free Wi-Fi, the bathrooms, the warmth, taking advantage of services designed for people who had nowhere else to go. People like them now. "I'll stay with Noah," Susan said. "He'll wake up soon. He'll want breakfast." Breakfast. They had half a box of cereal and no milk. They had peanut butter and 3 slices of bread. They had choices to make about which meal mattered more, lunch or dinner, because they couldn't afford both. David folded the scarf and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he kissed Susan on the forehead. She closed her eyes, leaned into him for just a second. "We're going to be okay," he said. "I know." They both knew it was a lie, but it was the lie they told each other every morning, and some days it was enough. The walk to the library took 20 minutes. David kept his hands in his pockets, the scarf pressed against his palm. The neighborhood looked different in daylight. Smaller, meaner. Houses with peeling paint and chain-link fences. Cars that ran on prayer and duct tape. This wasn't where they'd planned to end up, but plans didn't mean much anymore. The library was half full. A few older people reading newspapers. Some teenagers on the computers, probably supposed to be in school. A young mother with 2 small children, reading picture books in the corner. David signed in for a computer, got his 1-hour slot, sat down at the terminal, farthest from everyone else. 17 new emails. 14 were spam. 2 were automated rejections from jobs he didn't remember applying for. 1 was from a company called Integrity Transit Solutions. He clicked it. "Dear Mr. Miller, thank you for your inquiry regarding employment opportunities. While we don't have any openings that match your previous experience at this time, we'll keep your information on file. Sincerely, Human Resources." David closed the email, closed his eyes, pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose, and tried not to think about how many of these he'd gotten. How many polite, impersonal rejections. How many times he'd been told his information would be kept on file, which was a nice way of saying forgotten immediately. He'd been a senior rail safety compliance officer, 23 years of experience, certifications, commendations, a career he'd built from the ground up, and now he couldn't get hired to stock shelves at a grocery store. "Sir? You okay?" David opened his eyes. A librarian stood a few feet away, a young woman with concern creasing her forehead. "Fine," he said. "Just tired. Can I help you find anything?" "No, thank you." She nodded and moved away, but David saw her glance back, saw the worry. He knew what he looked like, unshaven, clothes that were clean but worn, the look of a man who was hanging on by his fingernails. He logged out of his email and pulled up Google instead. Margaret, rich woman, lost driver, her mess scarf. The search was pointless and he knew it, but he typed anyway, because what else was there to do? The results were useless, articles about fashion, celebrity gossip, nothing that mattered. He tried again. Margaret, philanthropist, transportation safety. This time something caught his eye. A news article from 6 months ago about a grant given to a transportation safety nonprofit. The donor was anonymous, but the article mentioned that the grant came through a foundation called the Clearwater Trust. David clicked through to the foundation's website. It was simple, professional. No photos, no names, just a mission statement about improving safety standards in transportation and infrastructure. And at the bottom, in small print, managed by M. Clearwater. M. Clearwater. Margaret. David sat back in his chair. It could be a coincidence. Margaret was a common name. M. Clearwater could be anyone. But the foundation focused on transportation safety, and Margaret had shown up at his door the night after he'd been thinking about every choice he'd made, every report he'd filed, every bridge he'd burned trying to do the right thing. His hour was up. The computer logged him out automatically. David stood, walked to the front desk, and asked if he could print something. The librarian nodded, charged him 50 cents he didn't have to spare. He printed the foundation's homepage, folded it, put it in his pocket next to the scarf. When he got home, Susan was in the living room with Noah. The boy was awake now, sitting on the floor with his coloring books. He looked up when David came in. "Grandpa." Noah scrambled to his feet, ran over, wrapped his arms around David's legs. David's chest ached. He put his hand on Noah's head, felt the soft curls, so much like Emily's. "Hey buddy," he said. "You have breakfast, cereal. No milk though." Noah said it matter-of-factly, like it was normal. And maybe for him, it was. He'd been living with them for 4 months now. 4 months of learning to accept less. "You color me something." "A dinosaur. I can't wait to see it." Noah ran back to his coloring books, already chattering about whether T-Rexes were really green or if maybe they were purple. Susan stood from the couch. "Any luck?" "No." David pulled out the printout. "But I found something. Maybe." He showed her the foundation page. She read it quickly, her eyes moving over the text. "You think this is her?" she asked. "I don't know. What would it mean if it was?" "I don't know that either." Susan handed the paper back. "Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe she was just a nice woman who got lost, and you're looking for a pattern that isn't there. Maybe." But David didn't believe that. And from the look on Susan's face, neither did she. Noah colored his dinosaur. Susan heated up the last of the chicken soup for lunch. David sat in the chair with the broken spring, and stared at the scarf and the printout, and tried to understand what Margaret had wanted him to understand. You're going to be faced with a choice. Not the small kind. A real one. Outside, the sun climbed higher, thin and weak. The house stayed cold. The electricity stayed off. And on the floor, Noah colored a purple dinosaur, humming to himself, unaware that the adults around him were watching him like he was a prophecy they couldn't yet read. 4 months earlier, the phone had rung at 2:17 in the morning. David would remember that forever. The exact time. The way the sound had cut through sleep like a blade, sharp and wrong. Phones didn't ring at 2:17 unless someone was dead or dying. He grabbed for it in the dark, knocked over a glass of water on the nightstand. Susan had sat up beside him, her hand on his shoulder, already knowing. "Hello, Mr. Miller," a woman's voice. Professional, careful, the kind of careful that meant bad news. "This is Memorial West Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Emily Miller." The room tilted. "What happened?" "There's been an accident. A car accident. I need you to come to the hospital right away." "How bad?" "Please come as soon as you can, Mr. Miller." The line went dead. David sat there with the phone in his hand, water dripping off the nightstand onto the floor, while Susan asked him what was wrong. What happened? Who was it? "David, please talk to me." "Emily," he'd said. There was an accident. He'd never driven that fast in his life. 60, 70, 80 down residential streets, running red lights, not caring. Susan beside him with her hands clasped together, praying aloud, the words tumbling out fast and desperate. "Please God, please God, please let her be okay. Please God." The hospital was white, fluorescent, too bright after the darkness of the drive. A nurse met them at the emergency entrance, took them down a hallway that seemed to go on forever. Doors on both sides, beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, something metallic. "Blood. She's in surgery," the nurse said. She was young, couldn't have been more than 30. Too young to have to tell parents their daughter might be dying. "The doctor will come talk to you as soon as he can." "What happened?" Susan's voice broke. "Please, what happened?" A drunk driver ran a red light, hit the driver's side. Your daughter was conscious when the paramedics arrived. That's a good sign. Conscious. That meant alive. That meant maybe okay. They sat in the waiting room, green chairs bolted to the floor, a television in the corner showing the news with the sound off, a vending machine humming in the corner. 3 hours, that's how long they waited. At 5:30 a doctor came out. He had blood on his scrubs, just a little, on the sleeve, but David saw it, couldn't stop seeing it. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, they stood. David's legs barely held him. I'm Dr. Patterson. I've been working on your daughter. He paused, and in that pause, David's entire world contracted to a single point. I'm very sorry. We did everything we could. No. She had severe internal injuries. We tried to repair the damage, but Susan made a sound. Not a scream. Worse than a scream. A sound David had never heard her make, low and broken and wrong. No, David said. You're wrong. The nurse said she was conscious. You said she was. But she crashed during surgery. We tried to resuscitate her for 40 minutes, Dr. Patterson's face was gray. I'm so sorry. She's gone. Gone. Such a small word for something so impossible. I want to see her, Susan said. Of course, I'll have someone take you. Now, right now. The doctor nodded, gestured to a nurse. Emily was in a room at the end of another long hallway, smaller, quieter. There were machines around her bed, all of them silent now. Tubes and wires that led nowhere. She looked asleep. That was the worst part. She looked like she was sleeping. Like David could touch her shoulder and she'd open her eyes and smile and say, "Hey Dad, what's wrong?" But she didn't. She never would again. Susan collapsed beside the bed, her hands clutching Emily's hand, saying her name over and over. Emily, Emily, sweetheart, baby please Emily. David stood in the doorway. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of a world where his 32-year-old daughter was lying dead on a hospital bed. A nurse touched his arm. Sir? There's a child here. He was in the car. David turned. What? Your grandson. Noah. He's 5, is that right? Noah. Oh God. Noah. Is he hurt? Bumps and bruises. He was in a car seat in the back. It saved his life. The nurse's eyes were kind. Too kind. He's asking for his mother. David looked back at Susan, at Emily. He couldn't leave, couldn't walk away from this. But Noah was alive. Noah needed him. Where is he? David asked. The nurse led him to a different room, a pediatric bay with cartoon characters on the walls. Noah sat on a bed that was too big for him, his legs dangling, his face streaked with tears. He had a bandage on his forehead, and a scrape down his arm. When he saw David, his face crumpled. Grandpa. David crossed the room, pulled Noah into his arms. The boy was shaking, small and scared and alive. Where's Mommy? Noah whispered. They said she got hurt. Is she okay? David's throat closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't figure out how to tell this child that his mother was gone, that the woman who'd sung him to sleep and made him dinosaur-shaped pancakes and promised him she'd always be there had just broken that promise forever. Grandpa. Noah pulled back, looked up at him with Emily's eyes. Is Mommy okay? No, buddy, David said. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere he didn't know he had. She's not okay, he's. He stopped, started again. Mommy got hurt really bad, and the doctors, they tried really hard to help her, but they couldn't. Noah stared at him, not understanding. Not yet. She's in heaven now, David said. And even though he wasn't sure he believed in heaven, even though his faith had been wavering for years, he said it anyway because Noah needed to believe in something. She's with the angels. When is she coming back? She's not coming back, Noah. But I want her to come back. I know, buddy. Noah started to cry. Hard, gasping sobs that shook his whole body. David held him, rocked him, and felt something inside himself break apart. A social worker came later, asked questions about next of kin, about custody, about where Noah would go. Emily had been a single mother. Noah's father wasn't in the picture, hadn't been for years. There were no other relatives. We'll take him, David said. Susan had come in by then, her face swollen and blank. She nodded. He's ours. The social worker explained the process: temporary custody, then permanent, paperwork, court dates, things that seemed impossibly bureaucratic in the face of what they'd just lost. They took Noah home at 9 in the morning, drove in silence, the boy strapped into a car seat the hospital had given them. When they pulled into the driveway, Noah looked at the house. "Is Mommy here?" he asked. "No, buddy," David said. "This is Grandma and Grandpa's house. You're going to stay with us for a while." "I want to go home." "I know." But home was Emily's apartment, and Emily was gone, and David didn't know how to explain to a 5-year-old that home didn't exist anymore. They got through that first day, somehow. Susan made Noah lunch. David called his boss, said there'd been a death in the family. The boss offered condolences and asked when David would be back to work. 3 days, David had said. He'd need 3 days. Looking back, that seemed insane. Like 3 days was enough to bury your daughter and figure out how to raise her child and stitch yourself back together into something resembling a functional human being. But that's what he'd said. 3 days. The funeral was on Thursday. Small. Emily had friends, but they were scattered, and David didn't have the energy to track them all down. Just him and Susan and Noah in the front row. A minister who'd never met Emily saying nice things that meant nothing. Noah didn't cry at the funeral. He sat between them in his small suit, the one they'd had to buy because he didn't own dress clothes, and stared at the casket. At the end he asked if he could say goodbye. David carried him up, let him touch the polished wood, watched as Noah pressed his small hand against it, and whispered, "I love you, Mommy." That night Noah woke up screaming. 3 times. Each time David went to his room, held him, told him it was okay, even though nothing was okay. The 3rd time, Noah wouldn't let him leave. "Stay," Noah said, his fingers digging into David's arm. "Please stay." So David stayed, sat on the floor next to Noah's bed, his back against the wall, until the sun came up. And he understood, in the cold dawn light, that this was his life now. This was what Emily had left him. Not intentionally, not as a gift or a burden, just as a fact. Noah was his responsibility. His child now, in every way that mattered. David looked at the boy sleeping, his face finally peaceful, his hand still clutching David's sleeve. And he made a promise to himself, to Emily, to whatever God might be listening. He wouldn't let go. No matter what, he wouldn't let Noah become another casualty of this nightmare, even if he had no idea how to keep that promise. The job had been good once. David remembered the first day he'd walked into the offices of Great Plains Rail Transport. 23 years old, fresh out of his safety certification program, thinking he was going to make railroads safer for everyone, fix the problems before they happened, save lives. He'd been naive, but he'd also been right. For 23 years, he'd been right. He'd worked his way up from junior inspector to senior rail safety compliance officer. He'd filed hundreds of reports, identified thousands of violations. Most were small, worn brake pads, inadequate lighting, things that got fixed quietly. But some were big. The Riverside Junction report was big. It had started 6 years ago, a routine inspection of a bridge that carried freight across the Platte River. The bridge was old, built in the 1960s, but it had been maintained, or it was supposed to have been. David had spent 3 days on that bridge, crawling over every beam, every support, every rivet, taking measurements, running stress tests, and what he'd found had made his stomach turn. The bridge was failing, not slowly, not in some distant future. Right now, cracks in the load-bearing supports, metal fatigue that should have been caught years ago, maintenance records that had been falsified to make it look like repairs had been done when they hadn't. His report had been clear: the bridge needed to be closed immediately, needed to be completely rebuilt. The cost would be in the millions. The cost of not rebuilding it would be lives. He'd filed the report on a Monday. By Wednesday he'd been called into a meeting. Not with his supervisor, with the VP of operations, a man named Richard Keller who wore suits that cost more than David made in a month. "David," Keller had gestured to a chair. "Sit down. We need to talk about your Riverside report." David had sat. "What about it?" "It's causing some concern." "It should."
The bridge is dangerous. Yes, well, Keller had leaned back in his chair. The thing is, we need to be reasonable here. Bridges that old always show some wear. It doesn't mean they're unsafe. This isn't wear. It's structural failure, according to your measurements, which I'm sure were done carefully. But measurements can be interpreted different ways. David's hands had tightened on the armrests. There's no interpretation here. The metal is fatigued. The load capacity is compromised. If we run loaded freight cars over that bridge, it could collapse. Could, but probably won't. Probably. Keller had smiled, the kind of smile that said he knew something David didn't. I've been in this industry a long time, David. Bridges last a lot longer than engineers think they will. We've run trains over Riverside for 50 years. We'll run them for 50 more. Not safely. Safety is important. Of course it is, but so is keeping freight moving. So is keeping our customers happy. So is staying in business. Keller had pulled out a folder. Rebuilding that bridge would cost $18 million. That's a significant hit to our capital budget. We'd have to cut costs elsewhere. Lay people off. Maybe close some routes. David had stared at him. You're asking me to change my report. I'm asking you to reconsider your assessment. Look at the data again. Maybe find some flexibility in your interpretation. There's no flexibility. The bridge is unsafe. Keller's smile had vanished. David, I'm trying to help you here. But you need to understand something. This company can't afford to shut down Riverside. And if you push this, if you insist on filing an official condemnation, there will be consequences. For who? The company, or for me, for everyone. But yes, for you especially. David had stood up. I'm not changing the report, and I'm forwarding it to the Federal Railroad Administration. They need to know. If you do that, Keller had said quietly, you won't work in this industry again. Then I won't work in this industry. He'd walked out, filed the report with the FRA, waited. The FRA had taken it seriously, sent their own inspectors, confirmed David's findings, ordered Great Plains to close the bridge pending repairs. Great Plains had complied. For exactly 2 weeks, then their lawyers got involved, found a technicality in the inspection protocol, argued that the closure was premature, got a judge to issue a temporary injunction, allowing them to continue operations while they studied the matter further. The bridge stayed open, and David got transferred to a desk job. No more field inspections, no more direct safety work, just paperwork and policy review. He'd filed complaints, gone to his union, made noise, which was when the real retaliation had started. Performance reviews that had always been excellent suddenly became mediocre. Projects he was assigned to got cancelled before he could complete them. Meetings he should have been invited to happened without him. He lasted 18 months before they found a reason to fire him. Not for the Riverside report. They were too smart for that. Instead, they'd claimed he'd missed a deadline on a routine filing. A filing he'd never been told about. A deadline that had never existed. But it was enough. In their system it was enough. His union fought it, for a while, but the company had better lawyers, deeper pockets, and in the end the union had suggested he take a settlement and move on. You're blackballed, David, his union rep had said. Everyone in the industry knows what you did. No one's going to hire you. I did the right thing. I know, but the right thing doesn't always come with a happy ending. The settlement was $43,000. After taxes and legal fees it came to $31,000. A year's salary more or less. Enough to live on while he looked for a new job. He'd been confident then. Confident that his experience would count for something. That there were other industries that needed safety officers. That someone would value integrity. That confidence lasted 6 months. Then Emily died, and suddenly the settlement money was going to funeral costs, to Noah's immediate needs, to emergency expenses David hadn't planned for. Then another 6 months passed, another 100 job applications, another 100 rejections. The $31,000 became $20,000, then 10, then 5, then none, and now here they were, in the dark, in the cold. raising a 5-year-old on hope and stubbornness. Sometimes late at night, David wondered if he should have changed the report, should have found that flexibility Keller wanted, should have looked the other way. The bridge was still standing. Trains still ran over it every day. Maybe Keller had been right. Maybe David had overreacted. But then he'd remember the measurements, the cracks in the metal, the falsified maintenance records, and he'd remember the choice he'd made, the choice to tell the truth, even when it cost him everything. He'd made the right choice. He was almost sure of that. Almost. The weeks after the funeral blurred together.
Susan had taken a leave of absence from her job at the elementary school. She was a teacher's aide part-time and the pay wasn't much, but it was something. Enough to cover groceries, some of the utilities. But Noah needed her more than the school did, so she stayed home, helped him adjust, dealt with the nightmares, the sudden crying jags, the way he'd ask for Emily a dozen times a day and then remember, and the light would go out of his eyes all over again. David had kept working. For a while. He'd gone back to the office, sat at his desk, tried to care about policy documents and compliance frameworks. But his mind was somewhere else. With Susan and Noah, with the funeral he couldn't stop replaying, with the impossible reality that his daughter was gone. 2 weeks after the funeral his boss had pulled him aside. "David, we need to talk about your performance. I know, I'm sorry. You're going through a difficult time, but we need someone in this position who can focus." "I can focus, just give me a little more time." But time was the one thing they weren't willing to give. He'd been let go the next day. No malice, no anger, just a quiet conversation in a conference room and a severance package that was barely more than 2 weeks' pay. After that Susan had tried to go back to work, but Noah wouldn't let her leave. He'd cling to her, crying, begging her not to go. And on the days she did manage to leave, the school would call an hour later because Noah had gotten sick or started crying and couldn't calm down. The principal had been kind, understanding, but understanding only went so far. "We love Noah," she'd said, "but he needs more stability right now. Maybe once he's settled you can come back." Susan had nodded, smiled, said she understood. Then she'd come home and cried in the bathroom for an hour. Money got tight, then tighter, then impossible. They'd started with the credit cards, small charges at first, groceries, gas, Noah's clothes because he was growing and the things he'd brought from Emily's apartment didn't fit anymore. Then bigger charges, the mortgage, utilities, car insurance. The cards maxed out faster than David had thought possible. They'd sold Emily's car. That had hurt more than David expected. It was just a car, an old Honda with a dent in the fender and a broken CD player. But it was Emily's. Her hands had been on that steering wheel. Her voice had filled that space. Letting it go felt like losing her all over again. The money from the car lasted 6 weeks. They'd tried cutting everything. No cable, no internet at home, no restaurants, no coffee, no anything that wasn't absolutely essential. They ate pasta and rice and chicken when it was on sale. They wore sweaters inside instead of turning up the heat. They learned to ignore the phone when creditors called. Noah noticed. Of course he noticed. He stopped asking for toys. Stopped mentioning the kids at the park who had bikes and scooters and things he didn't have. One night David heard him in his room talking to himself. "I'll be good, Mommy. I promise I'll be good. Please come back." David had stood in the hallway, his hand on the doorframe, and cried as quietly as he could. Susan found him there, pulled him into the bathroom, closed the door. "We can't keep doing this," she'd whispered. "I know. He needs therapy. He needs help processing this. We can't afford therapy. There are programs, free programs, with waiting lists that are 6 months long." Susan had pressed her face into his shoulder. "I don't know how to help him. You're doing everything you can. It's not enough." And that was the truth they both lived with. Whatever they did, it wasn't enough. Wasn't enough to replace Emily. Wasn't enough to give Noah what he needed. Wasn't enough to keep the lights on or the heat running or the bills paid. David kept applying for jobs, hundreds of them. Anything he was remotely qualified for: safety consultant, logistics coordinator, warehouse supervisor, retail management. The interviews, when he got them, always went the same way. Friendly at first, interested, then the question about his previous employment. "I see there's a gap in your work history. Can you explain that?" And David would have to decide, tell the truth and sound like a troublemaker or lie and hope they didn't check. He usually told the truth. He usually didn't get the job. The mortgage company sent a notice, 60 days behind, then 90, we're going to lose the house. Susan said, I'll figure something out. How? How are you going to figure it out? David didn't have an answer. They started looking at apartments. Cheap ones. The kind with thin walls and broken locks and neighbors who yelled at each other at 3 in the morning. Even those were barely affordable. Maybe we could move in with my sister, Susan suggested. In Florida. Noah just lost his mother. You want to take him away from everything he knows. Then what, David? What's your plan? He didn't have a plan. Just desperation and dwindling options and the growing certainty that he'd failed. Failed Emily. Failed Noah. Failed Susan. Failed himself. The power company sent a shut-off notice. Pay by Friday or lose electricity. They didn't have the money to pay. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notice, doing math that wouldn't work no matter how many times he tried it. Noah came in, climbed onto his lap. Grandpa, are you sad? David wrapped his arms around the boy. A little, buddy. Me too. I miss Mommy. I know, I miss her too. Noah was quiet for a moment. Then, are we poor? David's chest tightened. Why do you ask that? Aiden at the park said we're poor because we don't have a lot of toys. Aiden doesn't know what he's talking about. But we don't have a lot of toys. No, David admitted. We don't. Is it because I'm bad? Noah. David turned the boy to face him. Look at me. You are not bad. None of this is your fault. We're having a hard time right now. But it's not because of you. Noah nodded, but David could see he didn't really understand. How could he? He was 5 years old. The world was supposed to make sense at 5. Adults were supposed to have answers. That night the electricity went out for the first time. They'd known it was coming, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Noah had been terrified, clinging to Susan, crying, asking if the dark was going to stay forever. Just for tonight, Susan had said, even though she didn't know if that was true. Just for tonight, sweetheart. They'd used candles, the camping stove, slept in the living room with all the blankets they owned piled on top of them. And in the morning David had called the power company, begged for an extension, promised to pay, made promises he had no idea how to keep. They'd given him 3 days, 3 days to find money that didn't exist. That's when Margaret had knocked on the door. Friday afternoon, David counted the money they had left, $73.42. He counted it 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. Susan stood in the doorway, watching. She'd stopped asking for the total. The number only made things more real, more impossible. We could try the food bank again, she said. We went Wednesday. They said once a week maximum. Maybe they'd make an exception. Maybe. But David knew they wouldn't. The food bank was overwhelmed. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was desperate. Noah was in his room, coloring. He'd gotten quieter lately. Less playful. Like he could feel the weight pressing down on the household and was trying to make himself smaller to help. The rent's due Monday, Susan said. David didn't answer. They both knew there was no rent money. Hadn't been for 2 months. The landlord had been patient, but patience had limits. If we use the $73 for rent, Susan started. It's not enough. We need $400. I know, but it's something. It shows we're trying. Then we don't eat this weekend. Susan's jaw tightened. We have some rice, some beans. That's for Noah. We can share. He's 5 years old. He needs to eat. We all need to eat. David. They stared at each other across the kitchen. 2 people who used to know how to solve problems together, now just exhausted and scared. What if I call the temp agency again? Susan asked. See if they have anything. Even just a day's work. You tried that Tuesday. They said they'd call if something came up. I could go in person. Sometimes that helps. It's Friday afternoon. They'll be closed by the time you get there. Susan's shoulders slumped. She looked so tired. Too tired. Like she'd been running uphill for months and couldn't see the top. I'm sorry, David said. For what? For all of this. For not being able to fix it. Stop. Her voice was sharp. This isn't your fault. I lost my job. I can't find another one. That feels like my fault. You lost your job because you told the truth, because you cared more about people's safety than keeping Richard Keller happy. And look where it got us. Susan crossed the room, put her hands on his face, forced him to look at her. You did the right thing, and we're going to get through this. How? I don't know, but we will. David wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the certainty she was trying to project, but all he felt was tired. The phone rang. They both jumped. David pulled it out of his pocket. Unknown number. Hello, Mr. Miller? This is Jenna from Great Western Properties. I'm calling about your rent payment that was due. I know when it was due, right? Well, we need to discuss your options. You're now 63 days past due, and I'll have something for you Monday. Mr. Miller, I appreciate that, but we've been patient. We need the full amount, all past due rent plus this month's payment. That's $1,200. $1,200. They might as well have asked for $1 million. I need more time, David said. I'm sorry, but I don't have the authority to grant more time. Unless you can pay the full amount by Wednesday, we'll have to begin eviction proceedings. I have a child living here, a 5-year-old child. I understand and I'm very sorry, but the property owners. David hung up. Susan was watching him. How long? Wednesday. For the full amount. Yes. She sat down at the kitchen table, put her head in her hands. David wanted to go to her, wanted to say something comforting, but he had nothing. No comfort to give. No solutions. We should tell Noah, Susan said quietly. Tell him what? That we might have to move. Where would we go? I don't know. A shelter maybe. Just until no. The word came out harder than he meant it. We're not taking him to a shelter. We might not have a choice. There's always a choice. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting I don't see one. David looked at the $73 on the counter. It wasn't enough for rent, wasn't enough for food, wasn't enough for anything except maybe postponing the inevitable by a day or two. He thought about Margaret, about her words in the dark. You're going to be faced with a choice. This didn't feel like a choice. This felt like a trap closing. I'm going to take a walk, he said. David, I just need some air. He grabbed his coat and left before she could argue. Outside the sun was setting. The sky was orange and purple, beautiful in a way that felt insulting. How could the world be beautiful when everything was falling apart? He walked without direction, past houses where people were coming home from work, where lights were on, where dinners were cooking and families were gathering and life was normal. He walked until he reached the park, the one where Noah played sometimes, where Emily used to push him on the swings. The swings were empty now, the playground was quiet. David sat on a bench, watched the sun drop lower, felt the cold seeping through his coat. His phone buzzed. A text from Susan. Where are you? The park. I'll be home soon. Noah keeps asking for you. David closed his eyes. Noah, always Noah. The reason he couldn't give up. The reason none of this mattered except that it mattered completely. He stood up, started walking home, and as he walked he made a decision. They'd use the $73 for food. For Noah. The rent could wait. The eviction could wait. Everything could wait. Except making sure that boy had something to eat. When he got home the house was dark. The street light was the only illumination. Susan was sitting on the couch with Noah, reading him a book by the light of her phone. Grandpa. Noah scrambled off the couch, ran to him. David picked him up. The boy was getting bigger, heavier. Soon he'd be too big to carry. You hungry, buddy? David asked. A little. How about we make some pasta, with butter and cheese? We have cheese. We'll get some. Susan looked at him over Noah's head. Her eyes asked the question. David nodded. The rent could wait. That night they ate pasta with butter and Parmesan. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. Noah ate 2 bowls. After dinner David tucked him into bed. Noah grabbed his hand before he could leave. Grandpa, are we going to be okay? David squeezed his hand. Yeah, buddy, we're going to be okay. Promise, I promise. It was a lie. Or maybe it wasn't. David didn't know anymore. He went back to the living room. Susan was cleaning up the dinner dishes. Power company called, she said. We have until tomorrow at 5. Then they shut it off again. Okay, that's all you have to say. What do you want me to say, Susan? That I'll fix it? I can't fix it. I know you can't. Her voice cracked. I just want you to stop pretending this is all going to work out. What's the alternative? Give up. Maybe we should just accept that we can't do this. That Noah deserves better than what we can give him. Don't. David's voice was hard. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. Emily gave him to us. We're all he has. And what are we giving him?
Poverty, instability, a house with no heat and no lights. We're giving him love. Love doesn't pay the bills. They stood there, the dirty dishes between them, and for the first time since Emily died, David wondered if Susan was right. If maybe love wasn't enough. The power went out at 5:03 the next evening. Right on schedule. Noah cried. Susan held him. David stood at the window and watched the street light flicker on, the only light they'd have, and he thought about Margaret, about her prophecy, about choices. Whatever was coming, he hoped he'd be ready for it, because he wasn't ready for this. David couldn't sleep. 2 days after the power went out, 3 days after Margaret had appeared at their door, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Next to him, Susan's breathing was slow and even. She'd gotten good at falling asleep despite everything. A survival skill. He wished he could do the same. Instead, his mind kept circling back to Margaret's words. Soon you're going to be faced with a choice. Not the small kind, a real one. He'd thought at first she was talking about survival, about whether to give up, maybe, about whether to keep fighting or admit defeat. But that didn't make sense. Margaret hadn't seemed like someone who'd come to tell him to give up. It won't be a choice to save you from poverty. So not about money, not about fixing their situation. It will be a choice about what you keep. What you keep. David sat up carefully, trying not to wake Susan. He pulled on his robe and walked to the living room. Noah was asleep on the couch, the Mickey Mouse blanket tucked around him. The street light painted him in shades of amber. He looked so small, so vulnerable. For the child who's living with you, the one who's watching everything you do. David's breath caught. She hadn't been talking about survival. She'd been talking about who he was, who he'd be in front of Noah. He sank into the chair with the broken spring. The pieces were starting to come together. Margaret had asked about his choices, had told him about her own mistakes, about choosing power over principle and losing her daughter because of it. She'd recognized something in him, something similar to herself maybe, someone facing a moral test. But what test? They didn't have anything to lose anymore. No job, no money, no power to corrupt them. Unless David pulled out his phone. 2% battery. He opened his email before it could die. The message from Integrity Transit Solutions was still there. The polite rejection. We'll keep your information on file. He read it again, slower this time. Integrity Transit Solutions. He'd applied there 3 months ago. Applied for a safety auditor position. It was contract work, good pay, but he'd never heard back. Until that message, which wasn't really a rejection. Not exactly. It said they didn't have any openings that matched his previous experience. But what if they had other openings? Ones that didn't quite match, but that he could do anyway. His phone died before he could search further. David set it aside and leaned back in the chair. Maybe he was reaching, seeing patterns that weren't there because he was desperate for anything to make sense. Or maybe Margaret had known something he didn't. The Clear Water Foundation. Transportation safety. A woman who'd once been powerful and rich, and had walked away from it. A woman who'd shown up at his door the same night his power got shut off. That wasn't coincidence. David looked at Noah again, watched his chest rise and fall. The boy's face was peaceful in sleep, free of the worry that marked his waking hours. What you keep. Not money, not the house, not comfort or security. Integrity. That's what Margaret had been talking about. The thing David had kept when he'd filed that report on Riverside Junction. The thing that had cost him everything but that he'd refused to compromise. She'd recognized it in him, had wanted to see if it was real, if it was something he'd hold on to when tested. And she'd said a test was coming. David stood up, walked to the window. The street was empty, silent. A few houses down he could see Christmas lights, someone had put up early, red and green and white, blinking in cheerful patterns. They wouldn't have Christmas lights this year, wouldn't have presents or a tree, or any of the things that made the holiday special. But they'd have each other. They'd have Noah. And maybe if David was lucky, if Margaret had been right, he'd have a chance to prove that his integrity wasn't just something he'd shown once when it was convenient. Maybe the real test was whether he'd keep it when everything was on the line, when keeping it might mean losing what little they had left. When the easy path was right there waiting and all he had to do was bend just a little. He thought about Keller, about the bridge, about the choice he'd made. He'd been so sure then, so certain he was doing the right thing. But Emily had still died. Noah still suffered. Susan still cried herself to sleep some nights when she thought David couldn't hear. Had it been worth it? He wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that doing the right thing mattered more than the consequences. But standing in his dark, cold house, watching his grandson sleep on a couch because they couldn't afford to keep the heat on, the answer felt less clear. David pressed his forehead against the window. The glass was cold. "Please," he whispered. "To God, to Emily, to Margaret, to whoever might be listening. Please let me know what the right thing is. And please let it be something I can live with." No answer came, just the silence of the house and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. David went back to bed, lay down next to Susan, closed his eyes, and waited for the choice Margaret promised was coming. The email arrived on Tuesday morning. David was at the library, his daily ritual now. 1 hour of internet access, 1 hour of searching job boards, sending applications into the void, hoping for something that never came. He'd given up on hope, mostly. Now it was just routine. Something to do, a way to tell himself he was still trying. The email was from Integrity Transit Solutions. David's hand hesitated over the mouse. Another rejection, another polite dismissal. But he clicked anyway. "Dear Mr. Miller, we were recently made aware of your credentials and experience through a mutual connection. We have an opening for a senior safety auditor position that we believe would be an excellent fit. This is a contract position with the possibility of permanent hire. The role involves conducting independent safety audits for transportation companies across the Midwest. We're looking for someone with extensive experience, impeccable ethics, and a track record of integrity. If you're interested, please call me at your earliest convenience to discuss. Best regards, Frank Morrison, Director of Operations, Integrity Transit Solutions." David read it 3 times. A job, a real job, not retail, not warehouse work, an actual position in his field. It felt like a trap, or a dream, or both. He wrote down the number with shaking hands, then sat there staring at it. Through a mutual connection. What connection? He didn't know anyone at Integrity Transit Solutions. Didn't know anyone in the industry anymore who'd put their neck out for him. Unless Margaret. The Clearwater Foundation. Transportation safety. It had to be. David's chest felt tight. He looked around the library. A few people on computers. A mother reading to her toddler. The librarian sorting books behind the desk. Normal people doing normal things. And here he was holding a phone number that might change everything. Or might be another disappointment in a long line of them. He pulled out his phone. It was charged now. He'd left it plugged in at home overnight, running off the last dregs of battery. He dialed before he could talk himself out of it. 2 rings, then a man's voice. "Frank Morrison, Mr. Morrison, this is David Miller. I'm calling about David. Thanks for calling back so quickly. You got my email?" "Yes, sir." Good. Listen, I know this is sudden, but I wanted to reach out personally. We've heard excellent things about your work." "From who?" There was a pause. "A mutual acquaintance, someone who respects your integrity." "Margaret." It was definitely Margaret. "I appreciate the call," David said carefully. "But I need to be honest. I'm sure you know about my employment history, about why I left Great Plains." "We do, and that's exactly why we want you." David blinked. "I'm sorry, David. We do independent safety audits. Our entire business model depends on having auditors who can't be bought or intimidated, who'll file honest reports even when it's inconvenient." Morrison's voice was warm, genuine. "What you did at Great Plains, that's not a liability to us. It's your qualification." Something in David's chest loosened, just a little. "The position is contract-based," Morrison continued. 6 months initially. You'd be auditing rail companies, trucking firms, transit authorities, anywhere we're hired to verify safety compliance. The pay is $75,000 annually, prorated for the contract period. $75,000. David's mouth went dry. That was more than he'd made at Great Plains. That was enough to pay rent, buy food, keep the lights on, maybe even start saving again. "When would this start?" he asked. "Immediately. This week if possible. We have 3 audits scheduled that need someone with your experience." This week. David's mind raced. He could pay the rent, could pay the power company, could buy Noah new clothes, real food, maybe even some toys. "I'd love to accept," David said. "This sounds perfect." "Great. I'll send over the contract this afternoon. Look it over, and we can have you start Thursday if everything looks good. Thank you, really. This means David's voice caught. This means everything. We're glad to have you. Oh, one more thing. Morrison's tone shifted slightly, became more casual. The audits we do, sometimes the companies we're auditing don't love our findings. Sometimes they push back, try to negotiate. I understand. And we need our auditors to be firm. Professional but firm. These companies are paying for honest assessments even if they don't always want to hear the truth. Morrison paused. Of course there's always some room for interpretation. Some flexibility in how you present findings. We're not looking for people to be rigid, just honest. Something cold touched the base of David's spine. What kind of flexibility? He asked. Oh, you know, phrasing things in ways that acknowledge complexity, finding solutions that work for everyone, being realistic about what can be fixed immediately versus what can be addressed over time. David's hand tightened on the phone. Are you asking me to soften reports? No, nothing like that. Morrison laughed, but it sounded forced. I'm just saying that sometimes there's more than one way to describe a situation. And the companies appreciate auditors who understand that. I see. Look, we're not asking you to lie or ignore real dangers. Just be reasonable. Work with the companies instead of against them. That's what makes us successful. David closed his eyes. You're going to be faced with a choice. There it was. The choice Margaret had warned him about. Take the job, feed his family, keep the lights on, save Noah from shelters and food banks and the constant fear that colored his days. All he had to do was be reasonable. Find flexibility. Work with companies that might be cutting corners, might be putting profits over safety, might be doing exactly what Great Plains had done. And what would he tell Noah? What would he tell himself when he looked in the mirror? Mr. Morrison, David said quietly, I appreciate the offer. I really do, but I think there might be a misunderstanding about who I am. I don't think when I filed that report at Great Plains, I knew what it would cost me. I knew I'd lose my job, probably lose my career. And I filed it anyway because people's lives were at stake. David's voice was steady now, clear. I'm not the kind of auditor who finds flexibility. I'm the kind who tells the truth, even when nobody wants to hear it. Silence on the other end. So if you're looking for someone who'll soften reports or work with companies to make findings more palatable, I'm the wrong person. But if you want someone who'll give you honest assessments, who'll document every violation and risk and shortcut, then I'm your guy. More silence. Then Morrison sighed. David, I appreciate your integrity. I really do, but I have to be honest with you. The job market is tight, and people with your reputation don't get a lot of offers. I know. So maybe think about whether this is really the hill you want to die on. We're offering you a good salary, important work, a chance to get back in the industry. I have thought about it, David said. For months, every night when I can't pay the electric bill, every time my grandson asks why we can't afford something, every single day, and I'm still the same person who filed that report. David stood up. The librarian glanced over and he lowered his voice. I can't be someone else, even if it would be easier, even if it would solve all my problems. Then I'm sorry, Morrison said, but we need someone who can be practical. I understand. Good luck, David. I mean that. The line went dead. David set his phone down. His hands were shaking. He'd just turned down $75,000, just threw away the only job offer he'd gotten in months. Susan was going to kill him. Or worse, she was going to understand. She was going to look at him with those tired eyes and nod and say it was okay. They'd figure something else out, even though they both knew there was nothing else to figure out. And Noah, God, Noah. David put his head in his hands. He'd made the right choice. He knew he had. The same choice he'd made with the Riverside report. The same choice Emily would have made. But it hurt. It hurt so much he could barely breathe. His hour was up. The computer logged him out automatically. David stood, walked out of the library into the cold December morning.
He had to go home, had to tell Susan, had to explain why he'd just condemned them to eviction and poverty and all the things they'd been desperately trying to avoid. But first he walked, past the park where Noah played, past the convenience store where they counted pennies for milk, past the houses with their Christmas decorations and warm lights and all the security David had just walked away from. He walked until he found himself at Emily's grave. The headstone was simple, just her name and dates. They hadn't been able to afford anything elaborate. David knelt in the grass. It was wet from morning dew, cold through his pants. "I hope I did the right thing," he said. "I hope you'd be proud." The grave didn't answer, but the sun was coming out now, breaking through the clouds, weak and pale. But there, David stood, brushed off his knees. Then he went home to tell Susan what he'd done. She cried, but not for the reasons he'd expected. "I'm proud of you," she said, her arms around him. "I'm so proud of you. We're going to lose everything. We already lost everything that mattered when we lost Emily. Everything else is just stuff. Noah needs more than stuff. He needs stability, security. He needs to know that the people raising him have principles, that we don't compromise who we are, even when it's hard." Susan pulled back, looked at him. "You showed him that today. He doesn't even know what I did." "Not yet, but one day he will. And he'll understand what kind of man his grandfather is." David held her and let himself believe, just for a moment, that she was right, that integrity was worth something, even if it cost everything else. 3 months later, David sat in his small office and looked out at the rail yard. Not a fancy office, just a desk, a computer, a filing cabinet, a window that overlooked tracks where freight cars sat waiting for inspection. But it was his. The job had come 2 weeks after he'd turned down Morrison's offer, not from Integrity Transit Solutions, from a different company, a smaller firm that did legitimate independent audits, that actually wanted someone who wouldn't compromise. The pay was half what Morrison had offered, $37,000 a year, but it was enough. They'd paid the back rent, turned the electricity back on, bought groceries without counting every penny. They were still careful, still lived frugally, still shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons, but they weren't drowning anymore. Noah had his own room now, in a small apartment, nothing fancy but his. He'd started kindergarten, made friends, started smiling again, real smiles that reached his eyes. Some nights he still cried for Emily, probably always would, but other nights he laughed, told them about his day, drew pictures of dinosaurs and spaceships and a family with 3 people in it. David picked up the newspaper on his desk. He'd started reading it again during lunch. A small luxury. Today's paper had a feature on page 6. A new transportation safety foundation that was funding research into infrastructure improvements. The Clearwater Foundation. The article mentioned that the foundation was founded by an anonymous donor, a philanthropist who'd made her fortune in business but now focused on making transportation safer for everyone. There was no picture, no name except Clearwater, but David knew. He folded the paper carefully, set it aside. He'd never seen Margaret again, never called the foundation, never tried to confirm what he suspected. Some things didn't need confirmation. She'd come to his door when he needed to remember who he was. She'd offered him a test, and he'd passed, or maybe failed, depending on how you looked at it. Either way he'd chosen, and he was living with that choice, not in comfort, not in security, but in peace. The kind of peace that came from being able to look at yourself in the mirror. The kind that came from knowing you hadn't betrayed the people you loved, even when betraying them would have been easier. David's phone buzzed, a text from Susan. "Noah wants to know if you can pick him up from school today. He made something in art class, he wants to show you." David smiled. "On my way," he typed back. He shut down his computer, grabbed his coat, locked the office door behind him. Outside it was early March. Still cold but warming. The kind of weather that promised spring was coming. David drove to the elementary school, parked in the pickup line with the other parents and grandparents. When Noah came out, he was carrying a large piece of construction paper. He climbed into the back seat, carefully protecting whatever he'd made. "Grandpa, look," he held up the paper. It was a drawing, stick figures, colored with markers and crayons. 3 people holding hands. A tall man, a woman with glasses, a small boy with curly hair. Above them, in large letters, "My family," and in the corner, in smaller, more careful letters, "I love you." David's throat closed. "You like it?" Noah asked. "I love it, buddy. We'll put it on the fridge when we get home." Front and center. Front and center, Noah beamed. They drove home in comfortable silence. When they pulled up to the apartment building, Noah unbuckled himself and climbed over the seat to give David a hug. "Grandpa." "Yeah, thank you for taking care of me." David closed his eyes, held his grandson tight. "Thank you for letting me," he said. That night after dinner, after Noah was in bed, David stood in the kitchen looking at the drawing on the refrigerator. Susan came up behind him, put her arms around his waist. "You did good," she said. "We did good. Emily would be proud." "I hope so." They stood there, holding each other, looking at the stick figure family drawn by a 5-year-old who'd lost his mother but found people who'd do anything to keep him safe. Even turned down salvation when salvation came with compromise. David thought about Margaret, about her prophecy, about the choice she'd warned him was coming. She'd been right. The choice hadn't been about money, it had been about what kind of man he'd be when Noah was watching. What kind of grandfather would raise him? What kind of example would shape him? And David had chosen to be the kind of man who told the truth, even when it cost everything. The kind of man Emily had raised him to be, the kind of man Noah deserved. Outside, a train whistle blew in the distance. The sound of freight moving through the night, over bridges and tracks that someone, somewhere was making sure were safe. Inside the apartment was warm and full of light, and on the refrigerator, 3 stick figures held hands under a bright yellow sun, a family, imperfect, struggling, surviving, but together, and that, David thought, was enough, more than enough.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.